Over the years, Keith has built HON 30 layouts based on the Gilpin Tram in 3 different homes, and now has settled on a small shelf layout inside a 10 by 11-foot spare bedroom. Most of his rolling stock is scratch built, and the highly modified locomotives run on N-scale chassis. Now he's converting over to dead rail. Wow, where does he find space in those tiny locomotives? I guess we'll find out here in a minute. One of Keith's main interests is operations, and he does this with a simple car card system. Keith resides in Minneapolis, where he has long winters, which tend to be very conducive to model building. This should be interesting. Keith, welcome to Off the Beaten Track. The floor is yours.
Modeling the Gilpin Tram in HON 30. And what I'm doing is basically trying to recreate some of the Gilpin Tram prototype scenes in what amounts to a pretty small space, and at the same time be able to run realistic operations and have the time and the space to model what I want to model, which is operations, mining scenes, milling scenes, and I'm a builder too. So this concept has worked out well for me. Basically, it's modular sections assembled into a fairly small room, but it works for me, and I'll show you how we do it. Why the Gilpin Tram? Well, I first started hiking around there in the 1986, and I became really enraptured with how compact everything and low key the railroad actually was. The name Gilpin Tram means a lot of things, but instead of like a chartered common carrier like the Rio Grande or probably the Rio Grande Southern or whatever, a tramway was more of an industrial line, low key, basically built for a specific limited purpose, such as hauling gold ore down to the mills and coal back up to the mines. So this picture kind of captures a lot of the essence of the Gilpin Tram. We see shays, which are pretty cool. We see their distinctive ore cars being pulled up the track. There's a pretty sharp curve there. And we see what is a very simple bridge, really more of a culvert that the train is crossing. Then in the background, we see a pretty steep hillside. So I love mountains. And there's at least 4 mines in that picture. The mine right above the smoke plume actually was served by the Gilpin Tram. They just simply tram the ore down to a siding down below and coal back up. So pretty simple concept for this railroad. You basically run up the mountains to pick up gold ore, maybe bring some supplies up and come back down. So what's not to like with a bunch of gold mines and mountains and all the other great things? Why HON 30? Well, HON 30 is kind of a compromised way of modeling 2-foot gauge. We use N-scale track, mechanisms, wheel sets, and all that to depict 2-foot gauge, and that really scales out more to 30 inches, but close enough. A lot of modelers have used this to depict the main 2-footers, and then some of us are doing other things. Although I haven't met another Gilpin Tram modeler in HON 30, but I know there's got to be some out there. In this slide, you see a couple of photos on top, and some of you may recall AHM used to sell these mini trains lines back in the 60s, often discounted in discount stores. And I remember buying this stuff at Woolworths. So for example, I could buy that steam locomotive for $5. And on the right, I could buy a whole train set for $10. So as a young kid, that was a nice way of getting started in the hobby. And the stuff was rather crude and it didn't run very well, but it was a start. And so with that, I've stuck with HON 30 over the years. So I realized after several years of trying this and that I build small, I build slow, and I really don't need a lot of stuff to keep myself amused. So with that said, a smaller layout works out pretty well. And modeling the Gilpin Tram works out pretty well for me because it was a low-key line. There's no signaling on the line. There were no, in the prototype anyway, no passenger trains or pretty informal operations. So this track plan depicts one configuration of the layout. It fits a 10-foot by 11-foot room. So the layout has 26 lineal feet long, and there's some symmetry there because the real Gilpin Tram is only 26 miles long. So that just kind of came out by coincidence. But you can see the track plan is pretty simple. But let me show you what I've built. So we're going to start at what it call the far end of the line. And on this track plan, that'd be the lower right corner. And we're going to work our way down the mountain into Black Hawk. So let's see what we have. This is kind of a typical train setup. I have Shay pulling some of the Gilpin Tram ore cars, and we're at one of the gold mines. Well, the Shay is a modified N-scale Atlas Shay, so basically a new superstructure. And at this time, things were run with DCC. The ore cars shown here were all 3D printed, and I just bought various models through Shapeways. I didn't design them myself. And the mine in the background is the St. Louis mine. St. Louis mine was a real mine served by the Gilpin Tram, and these mines were small. The Gilpin Tram basically was using like 1880s technology throughout the life of the railroad. And for the most part, a lot of the mining operations and the railroad never really upgraded all that much. So mine structures were small in this area, which makes them ideal to model. So that structure is pretty close to what the real size one was. In the foreground, we see one of the Gilpin's coal cars, and then one of the three cabooses, which is basically more like one friend described it as a garden shed on trucks, and not too much to that one. But once we leave the St. Louis mine, we start heading downgrade a little bit. We come to two more mines. We have the Hecla mine on the right, and then we have the Quartz Hill mine back on the left. And all this is done on a shelf. Keep in mind, this scene is 12 inches deep. So on this day, we see Shay number 6 switching the Quartz Hill mine. Now, all of you Gilpin Tram aficionados realize they only had 5 Shays. Well, I picked up a brass model Shay, which was 2-cylinder and T-boilered. So Gilpin had nothing like that. So that became number 6. And it's a model railroad, so what the heck. The Hecla mine is a freelance mine. I couldn't resist building something like this. It was kind of based on a mine that had a tramway terminal, and we'll come back and take another look at this one. But in the foreground, we see Gilpin Tram's typical ore cars. These were really quite crude compared to other more modern narrow gauge freight cars. It was basically a steel hopper bin bolted to wood platform. So over the years, the bolts would kind of loosen, the cars would sag. Never air brakes, all hand brakes. So very simple, very crude, kind of fits the low-key, low-speed model tram that I'm trying to model. As we continue switching on the same scene, we come across the Quartz Hill mine. Some of you might recognize this. I had an article in Gazette about 15 years ago on this mine. This is also a real mine that was up on Quartz Hill and may have been served by the Gilpin Tram. Not so sure about this one, but it was certainly adjacent to the main line and a spur, so it certainly could have shipped on them. You can still buy this mine as a kit from Wild West scale model builders. And in this scene, there's basically a couple ore cars being ready to be picked up by one of the ore trains. The next step, we see the Quartz Hill mine on the right, by the way. We come to the small town of Bucksnort. And Bucksnort, I just borrowed the name. It's a real place. It's next or near the CNS Platte Canyon line. It's just uphill a little bit from Pine. And it's a really funky place. If you've ever been there, you'll like it. If you haven't, you should stop by and see the Bucksnort bar. But it was the inspiration for this small hamlet kind of set back in the mountains. Totally freelance, but again, it's a model railroad. In fact, now we see a Forney pulling a passenger car on the Gilpin Tram. I'll get back to that in a little bit, why that is showing up. But again, it's a model railroad, and I'm having a lot of fun. We round the corner, and now we're on the next wall of the layout room, and we come across the Woods mine. The Woods mine was yet another prototype mine on the Gilpin Tram, and it was a regular Gilpin shipper. There's photographic evidence of it and so forth. And so in this scene, we see on another day, it's Shay number 2 switching a train. We see we picked up some loads. There's some being pulled, some being pushed by the locomotive. And that was very prototypical for the tram. There were spurs all over the place, some trailing, some facing point. So as a result, the railroad was rather informal with what was where on the train. And that makes it fun for operating sessions. In the same general scene, we see shade number 2 is uncoupled and it's pulling back into a switchback spur. It's going to be switching some cars to the Woods mine, and adjacent to it was the Buckley mine. The Buckley mine in this picture was yet another mine that was on the Gilpin Tram and a shipper. And this model is, I think, a pretty close representation of the actual one. And I think I'm hesitant because all these mines that I'm modeling, there are no foundations left. There was really no close-up photos of any of these mines. And there's very little documentation, including lack of sandborne maps for most of these. So it's guesswork based on photographs. And the photographs aren't great because usually these things are some distance away from the photographer, kind of in the background or in a corner of a photo. So it's been kind of a fun adventure just going through and trying to picture how these mines were actually constructed. In the foreground, we see another coal car. Some of these Gilpin cars, the early ones, were only about 3.5 feet wide. They were very small. And we see another one, the Gilpin's 3 cabooses. And this one happened to be a resin kit from Toma that I got to not too long ago. And here's another view of the Shea switching the Buckley and Woods mine. The Buckley mine is just has really a weird roof line, which to me makes it attractive to model because it's such a homely looking building. On some of these photos, you might notice the roofs are looking a little rough. And that's really because a lot of these mine models are now over 20 years old. All the roofs are removable because they all have detailed interiors. And over the years, a lot of visitors have been pulling those roofs off to look, including my grandchildren. So I probably need to do a little tune up here one of these days to fix some of that. But here we see Shea number 2 picking up a load of ore from the Buckley mine. And it's a 12-inch scene, really fun to model. Nice, nice mine structure. And you notice scattered throughout are a bunch of log cribbing walls. And a lot of areas, the Gilpin Tram track was set into the hillside. There'd be waste rock dumps above the track, sometimes below. So retaining walls, either of stone or cribbing, are all over the place, which really makes it nice for modeling because it's a lot easier to get vertical surfaces, raised models in a narrow space when you have these abrupt elevation changes. Also, the area was pretty well logged out at this time because the miners were cutting down the trees for either lumber or firewood. So you don't have to model too many trees either when you're modeling these active mining districts. And as we move along, we come to another mine. And of course, this was also a Gilpin Tram shipper. And this model is based on what dimensions I could obtain. This one was a little more scientifically built because there was a boiler remediating at the site and I could see where the shaft had been plugged. So by pacing off the distance between the boiler stack and the shaft, I therefore imagineered how the mine would have looked and kind of proportion it based on photos. And this is what I came up with. So here we see Shea number 4 on another day coming by, switching the mine. And you can really see in this photo, I mentioned the roofs are getting kind of rough. Another removable roof showing interior details and more of the omnipresent log cribbing holding up the waste rock. So far, we've seen 5 different mines, and 4 of those were prototype mines built on the Gilpin Tram. Now, as we're getting a little closer to Black Hawk, we come to an open area, and we see the town of Black Hawk off in the distance. And let's head down there. This is the commercial district of Black Hawk. There are some elements that are based on prototype structures, and other areas I just built them for the fun of it, using some scratch built, some kits, and some odds and ends to cobble together a town scene. The town scene is only about 16 inches square. This is a small shelf layout, so there's a lot going on in a small space. And I've had a lot of fun building wagons over the years. There's used to be the Jordan kits available. Now there's the Berkshire Valley kits, and I have more wagon kits now than I'll ever build, and probably would never have road space for, but they are fun to build. As we continue into Black Hawk, we now come to kind of the end of the line, and from left to right, we see the Black Hawk machine and boiler works. That's a Gilpin shipper, at least in my world. Then we come to the Black Hawk depot. Some are saying, wait a minute, I'll come back to that later and explain. And then we see one of the stamp mills served by the Gilpin Tram, and then we see the edge of the beautiful downtown Black Hawk area. Pulling back a bit with the camera, we see a little more detailed Black Hawk. In the left foreground is the CNS track coming in, and that's the transfer to the Gilpin Tram. They tended to ship a lot of coal up to the mines, so it was basically hand shoveled into Gilpin Tram ore cars. I'm sorry, coal cars. And then right behind that, we see the Chamberlain Sampling Works. That's a very vital part of the mining industry in the area, and we'll be taking another look at that. Moving to the right, we see more of the complex for the Gilpin machine and boiler works there. And that actually started because I think like most modelers, you buy interior shop details and machinery from SS Limited, Rio Grande models and all that. And so the impetus for that model was basically, let's build a model where I can assemble this machinery and show it off. So all those little buildings have removable roofs, and they're lit up at night, and they're just loaded with shop machines and details, and it's a source of traffic on the layout. We're looking towards the very end of track in Black Hawk, and in the foreground we see the Black Hawk yard. In the distance, we see the engine house. There's another stamp mill off to the right, and then some residences and other businesses. Here we're looking back in the corner is the Golden Fleece Mill. This was a real stamp mill, and it was a Gilpin Tram customer, and it fits in the corner, my layout, quite nicely. It had an elevated trestle where ore cars were pushed up and then unloaded for processing. We're looking at the Gilpin yard again, and there's several structures that are freelance. They really weren't part of the real scene back then, but there's a couple of spurs back there for various industries that I had a model. And then here we see another shot of a switcher switching some Gilpin Tram cars in the yard. And there's cars that were not, well, never ran on the Gilpin, but they run in my layout, and that's just part of being a model layout. I have some freelance components, and I have some prototypical components. And finally, we come to this scene with the Gilpin Tram engine house. And this is, well, it's a must on any layout to have engine facilities. And on the Gilpin Tram, in the early years at least, this also doubled as car repair facilities, plus taking care of the locomotive. So it's a very important part of the layout. Here's a short look again at the track plan. Kind of shows you where we've been and where we're poking around the different mines. Keep in mind, this is a small layout. It's 26 lineal feet. So the left leg is about 8 feet long, and then we have an 11-foot long wall, and then we run about 8 feet or so down the other wall. And this is by choice. You know, with the different homes over the years, I could have chosen a bigger space, but I just come to realize that I like building small because I build slow and I change my mind frequently, and it works for me. Here's the layout room, the way it looks today. And you can see that the shelf just runs around the wall. On the left there is the Gilpin Tram Black Hawk area. And that basically was set in what was meant to be a closet alcove. So there I put a overhead shelf for storage and a valance and some LED lighting. Going around the corner, we have a removable section in front of the window. I really don't ever need to remove it, but I can if I need to. And that houses some of the mines. And then we come across this other leg, which is showing, well, keep in mind, this is 12 inches wide, this scene. And in HON 30, you can cram quite a bit of track and buildings in there. And that kind of ties in with why I'm modeling this area and why it works so well for my situation in my room. This is a photo taken about 1900 of the real Gilpin Tram, and it shows the Buckley Mine Branch. And the Buckley Mine Branch was one of about 7 branches on the Gilpin Tram that served mines. There were 4 mines situated along, and I modeled all 4 of them. What's interesting is when you look at where the track ran, that's the red line. You can see 4 mines, and if you might recognize those names. We looked at models of all 4 of them, and just look how crammed together things are. Here's the mines, all within a half mile of each other, and they're perched on the hillside right above part of Central City. Things were really crammed together in Gilpin County. And then we look in the background, and there's a lot of waste rock dumps for different mines, and an awful lot of those were also reached by various switchbacks and served by the Gilpin Tram. So there's a lot of modeling potential here. I'm never going to run out of topics. But one of my main objectives of modeling this is to model prototypical scenes the best I can. And so here's an example of the Woods Mine. The Woods Mine was at the beginning of the Buckley Mine Branch. And I mentioned there's usually just some lousy photos available to show this stuff. This is no exception. This was an 8x10 glass plate. And if you really enlarge it and look in the background, you can get this image of the Woods Mine. And again, just what a homely structure. They just kind of must have just kept adding to the covering over the head frame piecemeal. And to me, that makes a very attractive modeling subject, just kind of an odd looking building. So I built this about 23 years ago, I think. Very simple model, just I framed it up in styrene. The cladding is colored paper. The roof is corrugated metal, which is also colored paper. And then we see down here in the bottom photo, I put a full interior in with detail, and because I love detailing mines and all the equipment that goes with them. And this is just one example of all the mines that have this interior detail. The windows are pretty simple, just basic plastic castings from Grant Line at the time or Tichy. And then here's the finished model on the layout. I mentioned before that the Chamberlain sampler was a vital part of the mining industry in Blackhawk. And the samplers, at least in Gilpin County, the way they worked was it was a kind of a middleman between the different smaller mine operations and the large smelting operations. So what a mine operator could do, whether they're just a very small, 2-person operation or a larger one, they could bring smelting ore down to the Chamberlain sampler where, as the name implies, they would sample the ore, determine its value, and then they would, and this is very important, they would pay the miners very quickly, like, immediately. If they would have shipped them off to the larger smelting operations, it could be 3 months or more before they would get paid. And that just wouldn't do for a small operation. I mentioned smelting ore was shipped here. If it was mill dirt or lesser grade ore, it would have to go to a stamp mill and be concentrated before it'd be shipped out. But some of the ores are very high value and they would end up here. Well, this complex is pretty big. It never fit on my layout. We have the Chamberlain sampler on the left and the Randolph stamp mill on the right. And both of these were served by the Gilpin Tram. So I wanted to model the Chamberlain sampler. So I basically focused on the business end of the building. And that's basically the end where the Gilpin Tram track ran in. And also there was a doorway for horse teams to dump off ore. And this is how my model turned out. It's a very, very much condensed model of the real one. It's obviously a lot shorter than the prototype one, but it has to fit up against the backdrop on this 18-inch wide scene. And in here we see the Gilpin Tram tracks coming in where cars would be dumped, and then we would have the 3-foot gauge on the right there where ore would be shipped out in boxcars to the smelters in Denver, Pueblo, Omaha, whatever. And this is just a simple model, just thrown together from styrene, painted paper for the wood siding, and painted paper for the metal cladding and so forth. A lot of fun to build. Now back to the Blackhawk Depot. Obviously, this is the Central City Depot, and on my layout, I built a model of this depot and called it the Blackhawk Depot. The only reason being I just liked this one more than the actual Blackhawk Depot. So it was fun to build. I just slapped it together from styrene. I used some commercial brick siding and then just various evergreen shapes to put it together. This model is shortened from the prototype and also angled, kind of truncated to fit the scene that I have, but it was a lot of fun to build. Here it's models in progress and I haven't put the windows in yet, but I put a partial interior in and it's lit up at night, and it's a destination for the passenger trains that operate in my little model world. Now we come to the Gilpin Tram's engine house in Blackhawk. They called it a roundhouse, but there's nothing round about it. It was originally a horse barn, and the Gilpin Tram acquired it. And when they first acquired it, they had one chaise, so they had one stall. Then they acquired a second chaise, two stalls, and eventually they had a third chaise, and hence three stalls. And well, being a model railroader, you got to have engine facilities. It's hard to resist an engine facility, particularly something as simple and basic as this. So I built a model of it. I built a two-stall version. There's no pictures of the two-stall version, just the 1 and 3 stall, but it might have looked something like this back in the day. And I first got the idea from Lynn Wickersham. He built a O-scale two-stall model, and I saw it at a contest at one of the narrow gauge conventions, and that really got me intrigued. And so I finally decided I needed to build one. Plus, it fit in my small layout space a little better than the 3-stall. The 3-stall engine house, I originally built that in the 1990s, and there was an article about 25 years ago in Gazette on that 3-stall model. So it was fun building it twice. Wouldn't mind doing it maybe another time someday. I don't know. So here's the model under construction. Again, I put a full interior in, and that was fun because there's really no drawings or photos showing what the interior looked like. So it was an exercise in what might be. There was some reports that there was a water cistern for watering the locomotives inside, and maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, but my model, there is one. And keep in mind, in the early years, they also use this as a car repair shop, so you get a lot of bang for the buck with a small model. In that model photo over here, this little structure was apparently built for housing flammable materials, I assume oils and paints and things like that. And this kind of hints at, well, there's some car repair and operations going on here as well. I didn't overlook the Blackhawk commercial district. One of the neat structures was the Blackhawk Cracker Bakery. And if you look at some of the older pictures, it shows up quite a bit because it was down near the bottom of Main Street near the CNS trackage. And I wanted to build a model of it, but I didn't have room for the full-size structure. So I took the easy route, and I basically just kit bashed a couple of the Grant Line Street homes and scratch built the front, made a custom decal. And then about the same time, Grizzly Mountain Engineering came out with the laser cut bakery wagon kit. And I think Jerry Wilson designed this, and he might have based it on the same photo, but kind of a distinctive wagon. And it was a fun little scene to model right near the front of the layout, easy to see. And other scenes that they picked up on was, well, Eureka Street was important because there's a water tank there and a sweeping curve. And over here is one of their bridges, as they called it, really more of an elaborate culvert. This building right here was one of the water reservoirs for Central City. And it's a scene I wanted to model, so it easily fit into a corner on my modular layout. And here's my version of it. Obviously condensed quite a bit from the original, but I think it captures the flavor of it. But not everything's built, obviously in prototype scenes. One of them was the Hecla mine. Hecla mine was a real mine on Quartz Hill in Gilpin County. I have no idea if the Gilpin Tram ever served it. There's no record of it, but there were a couple mines in the area that had an aerial tramway, and that's what I wanted to model. And ever since I bought the kit, Grant Line, now San Juan, I think still sells it, sell this ore bin kit based on that one that sits by the depot, used to sit by the depot in Silverton. So I took that kit and used the ore bin is is kind of the foundation for the tram house, and then used a boiler house here from Design Tech, a resin kit, and then some other styrene odds and ends to build the model. And here's the finished result. It's a very vital shipper on the Gilpin Tram, at least in my little world. That little shed on the left was supposed to be the original top cover of the ore bin in the original kit. So it was a lot of fun just to kind of throw a bunch of styrene parts together and see what I could end up with. Now, here we're looking at one end of the layout. And those of you that are really paying close attention realize a lot of these photos don't always match up. Things kind of jump around in relative order. And that's true because this is a modular layout, meaning the sections are interchangeable to a great degree, and they're portable. And I actually have right now 5 more sections of the layout sitting in a closet shelf, and I have room to display them. And that's intentional. By building a layout this way, I can build more trains, track, and scenery than I have room for. And when I get tired of something or build something else, I can just kind of temporarily store it in a closet and then haul it out again when I want to see it again. And I can jump around from topic to topic if I want to as well. So here we see kind of example. We're looking at, and here's a 12-inch by 12-inch modular section. We see little pins at the end that are used to connect them. And the same end of the layout, this is how it sits today. There's a different scene on it, and it's a freelance town called Kingston. It was a real town site in Gilpin County, but railroad never ran to it. But in my world, it's a town with a coal dealer and a team track and some various stores. And this town scene is 32 inches long, 12 inches wide. So again, very compact in HO. This is another modular scene. It's a town called Nugget. Again, a real place, but never served by the railroad. And just kind of example of how much you can cram into a 12-inch wide module. This is also one of those that I built in Code 40, and I like how the Code 40 looks much better than the flex track I've been using. So I think all future expansions will have Code 40 track. And now just a little bit about how I build the layout. I mentioned these are modular, and not having a wood shop of my own, I didn't want to do anything too elaborate. So I found they're called artist boards, and I guess artists paint on them or something. I don't know. But if you go to an art store, you can find a whole selection of these pre-made boards. Some are made out of pretty fine materials, and these are the most basic ones. It's basically a piece of 1/8-inch hardboard fastened to a frame. Same pieces, if I turn them upside down, I see there's about a 7 or 9 ply piece of birch plywood that frames them. So they're nice and stable dimensionally. They come in a variety of lengths and widths. So I settle in mostly the 12-inch widths, and I just assemble pieces. In this case, a corner piece for my layout. So this is flipped upside down. So I'll flip it back over later and put track on top and build scenery. So I like this idea when I first bought these sections. So I built a trial layout just to see how would this work. So these have modular ends, which means they're interchangeable. Not every piece is interchangeable with every one, but there is a commonality to this. And again, these are all 12 inches wide and various widths, but I built a little roundy layout with some spurs and stuff just to see how it looked. This shows, you can put these in different configurations. I'm not sure if or why I would ever do this, but it's just kind of prove a point that, yeah, this concept seems to work. So I kept developing it. So here I started putting some basic scenery on, which is basically foam covered with a thin layer of Sculptamold and various things. And then as this little trial layout took shape, we started seeing the scenery show up. I have all these pieces. Some were finished further and are on the layout at the moment. Others are sitting stored in a closet for future use. And I did the same concept with the Black Hawk scene. I just took, I had a little wider space. So these are 18 inches deep instead of 12, but I just used colored electrician's tape to kind of lay the track work out full size to see what would and wouldn't fit. And this is close, but not the final track plan that I built. I did put together a scene just using combination of N scale Colt 55 turnouts, some N-scale flex track, and then a little bit of hand-laid track. You can see, for example, the crossing here, which is freelance, by the way, but where the 3-foot crosses the Gilpin Tram tracks. I try to build this thing smart, which means, for example, I was in the far corner of the layout, finishing that scene before moving to the front of the layout. And that was just to avoid breaking stuff off. I've done enough of that over the years. And here's the finished Black Hawk scene is how it looks today. So in about an 8-foot long space, I've put in 2 stamp mills, sampling works, several industry tracks, a yard, engine house, and a town, and even a 12-foot or 12-inch long section of residential area. So it was a lot of compromises to get to this point, but I think they turned out pretty well. Talking about compromises, Black Hawk was known as a city of mills. So I wanted to depict at least 2 stamp mills. The trouble was all the prototype ones I first wanted to model were too big, or just the way they're oriented, it would not fit into my layout. You might recall about 15, 20 years ago in the Gazette, I had an article on the Polar Star mill and ore chutes, and that was built for a previous layout and fit in there just fine. Here, I just could not figure out how to fit it into this area without taking up too much space, where I had to cut out too much other stuff. So the solution was to model the Fullerton mill and the Golden Fleece mill. Both of these were real mills that were on the Gilpin Tram, and both of them received ore shipments. Also, neither one ever had a photograph taken of it that survived. So there isn't much to go on, and that made them ideal prototypes to put on the layout. No one could probably prove me wrong, and I just built mills, these mills on kind of how other mills were built in the area, and they're a lot of fun to build. The Fullerton mill, for example, is just a modified mill kit from Wild West Scale Model Builders and a resin kit from Rusty Rail, and then just other odds and ends that I made up. But I like to operate this layout prototypically, and when I say prototypically, this is a low speed kind of a laid back line, and it's in line with a lot of industrial layouts others have modeled. I mean, over the years, you might recall articles by Woody Green, where he did an industrial line. Greg Wright has done an excellent one, kind of a mining tram. And it's a lot slower pace than some of the other railroads. And also, I think, well suited when you have a small, compact space. So I built this thing for operation. Right now I'm using car cards. I have a Mac-based switching list program, and I'm always flip-flopping back and forth between the two because I haven't quite found the perfect solution, but I do operate. Usually solo. I've only had a few sessions with the second operator, but it is fun. And because it's a model railroad I want to operate, I wanted to have a little more operations than just Gilpin Tram, because I like building box cars and things like that. So here's what I did. The blue line depicts the real Gilpin Tram, that spider web track, and then the yellow is the CNS coming into Black Hawk and Central City. Up on the right, the green line is the Denver and Salt Lake running up to Rollins Pass, and the red line was a actual railroad charter, the Gilpin, James Peak, and Middle Park, but they never laid a foot of track. It was just proposed. So just for fun, I kind of laid out what the route might have been based on their kind of vague description and looking at topo maps. And in my imaginary world, the railroad started with grandiose plans, ran to some of the smaller mining districts, and eventually ran out of money and investors and stopped there. So that's the excuse I have for running passenger trains, boxcar traffic, and anything else. So that's why when you look at Black Hawk, you see, well, a lot of things. You see rod locomotives, and you see boxcars, and you see lime cars and powder cars and cabooses with cupolas and everything else. And you see beer depots and mining supply houses, things that never were on the prototype Gilpin Tram, but run in my railroad. And you also notice there's rod locomotives showing up in these photos, and the shades seem to have disappeared. And there's a reason for that. I've switched over to dead rail. And dead rail is just kind of a loose term for radio-controlled locomotives powered by batteries. So there's no electrical connection at all to the rails. My entire layout right now is dead. There's no track power anywhere. The only electricity running through it is for the little LED lights I have in structures. So in this case, I took an inexpensive Thomas the Tank Engine locomotive made by Bachmann. It's built for the British 009 market, I think, and it actually runs quite well. And so I took the superstructure off here and started adding, different cab and detail parts. And then this little device right here is a radio receiver. It's about the size of the fingernail on my little finger. These things are tiny, and this technology is just great. If you think of all the little toy aerial drones and other toys you see sold, that same technology is scaled down to the point where we can easily use it in small locomotives like this. Some of you, probably in larger scales, are using other more sophisticated dead rail, where you're using what it basically is like a DCC controlled chip and maybe sound unit controlled by a battery. And that is something I love to do, but it's just too big for my locomotive. So I'm sticking with this very, very basic approach, but it works. This device right here is the battery. It's a lithium polymer battery, and it has enough oomph in it, if you will, to power the locomotive. So here's the complete locomotive. Very small, very compact. The only function on it is it has an operating headlight, and that's it. And I think you could say this is cute, if that applies. And I've gone on to convert some other locomotives as well. This one over here will be a 080 freelance tank locomotive. This is the battery here. Here's the receiver. And here's a little 060 tank locomotive. The battery is small enough to fit inside a cab. And that little battery is big enough to power the locomotive for about an hour. And, when you think of how if you're doing an operating session, unless you really have a long main line or you're running round and round, a lot of times your locomotive is standing still. It's going from one switching move to another. And that's true of my layout. So this one battery has enough charge for 2 operating sessions on my layout. And I'm just having a lot of fun with this, because these little mechanisms, you can imagine how touchy they are with electrical pickup and things. I don't have to worry about that anymore. Instead, I just focus more on running the trains and trying not to run through switches that are thrown the wrong way, which is easy to do. The shays, they've been set aside temporarily until I build my skills up a little bit more and switch those to dead rail. So that's what's coming up next. But in the meantime, I'm having a lot of fun riding this little railroad, and it just suits me well. And I hope some of you might have found some ideas here. Maybe you can apply it. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was a great presentation. Some interesting things going on there. Let me go over some of the comments we received. John Shearer asks, how do you regauge the wheel sets?
I do not regauge the wheel sets. This is not true 2-foot gauge. I use N scale, so that actually scales out to 30 inches.
Yeah, that's right.
I could probably use Z scale. That'd be about 20, 22 inches, but it's harder to get that stuff, and it's more expensive. N scale, inexpensive, easy to get, and so I don't have to regauge anything.
Steve Hollenbeck says, great small layout. Jake Swaney says, please repeat the mechanical body basis for the Shay locomotive.
It was Atlas, N scale, Shays, and they brought out, I think, 3 batches or so over the years. I think the first one came out in late 1990s, and they haven't imported those for at least 10 years. So if you're going to buy one now, you got to get it, used market or whatever. But they were great. You could get them pretty inexpensive in their day, but they're not available currently, to my knowledge.
Okay. Jake also asks if your track is hand laid.
It's a combination of things. I started out using Pico N scale, Pico 009, but that's code 80, and that's pretty big. It's reliable. So then I laid Blackhawk in code, a combination of hand laid code 55, some old, a friend Mark Wilson gave me a bundle of surplus H130 track code 55 that microscale used to make a long time ago. And that was enough to build, for me to build Blackhawk. And then I used some N-scale turnouts. But in the future, everything's going to be hand-laid code 40, which I found works out really well when you have dead rail, because you don't have to rely on good connection to the track for electrical pickup. And those small mechanisms I found were very touchy before. So this way I can just go ahead and basically lay rough code 40 track, and as long as things stay on the track, everything will be good.
Neat. Chris Lane says, killer presentation, Keith. Jim Spice, great detail. Alan Pollock, super presentation and layout. Scott McLeod says, super presentation, Keith. Fun to see the Gilpin Tram come to life. Lynn says, great presentation on an excellent version of the Gilpin Tram. John Shear, great idea for a senior needing to downsize. That's true. It's amazing what you accomplished there. Leach, Mr. Leach says, great layout, Keith, some great ideas too. Nick Gully, what does the RC handheld controller look like?
It is, if you, well, actually, the previous presentation on DCC, they showed what they called like basically just a road throttle. Remember, it was I think he had like a Digitrax, the utility throttle. It's about the same size. I'm using products from DT, or commonly called Deltang. It's a British firm, and they have a line of products suited for model railroaders, and they sell their controllers. And you could probably build your own, but I'm not that kind of guy. So I just bought 3 of them and use those for if I ever have 3 operators, we would build each operator train.
Great. Dave Adams says, great layout with a lot of really good ideas that are outside the box, and I endorse that. Ian McKinley sends, great layout, thanks. Reiner, Gilpin Borietti, stunning. I don't know what to say. Keith Stamper, really love the homogeneous look of the layout. The muted colors and the overall appearance of the layout is wonderful. It reminds me of Harry Brunk's layout in that the structures and over the colors all blend. Very true, very true. Phil Edmund, outstanding layout in a small space. Keith Stamper, really love the, oh, that's a repeat. Bob Poley, Keith, I really enjoyed your presentation. You are clearly having fun, and your modeling is very easy to enjoy. Well, that's it. And Keith, again, thank you very much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. And Russ, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Keith. That is inspirational indeed.